December 19th, 1944, and the air inside General Eisenhower's headquarters in Verdun was thick with tension, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling while the sharp scent of wet wool hung heavy in the room. Outside those walls, German tanks were ripping through the Ardennes forest, carving what history would soon call the Bulge, a massive wound in the Allied lines that threatened everything they had fought for. Inside, staff officers hunched over maps spread across wooden tables, their faces pale and drawn, exhaustion written in every line. But worse than that, you could see the fear in their eyes, the kind of fear that comes when you realize the enemy has caught you completely off guard. When Lieutenant General George Patton walked through that door, some of the officers didn't even bother looking up because they had already heard the reports and they knew how bad things were. The surprise had been absolute and devastating. 250,000 German troops, over 1,000 tanks, rolling through positions that were supposed to be quiet, and now the entire American First Army was in complete chaos with units shattered and scattered, communications cut, soldiers lost in the frozen forests. And here was this man, this volatile and controversial commander with a reputation for reckless aggression and a history of incidents that had nearly ended his career, about to make a promise so ridiculous that it bordered on pure fantasy. Eisenhower, calm but clearly worried, asked the question that everyone in that room was thinking. How long would it take you to turn your Third Army north and hit the Germans in their flank? Patton didn't even pause to think. 48 hours, he said, his voice steady and confident. I can attack with 3 divisions in 2 days. The room went completely silent for a moment, and then someone actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that was quickly smothered because this wasn't funny. This was desperate. Think about what he was proposing. Pull 6 entire combat divisions out of active fighting where they were already engaged with the enemy. Turn them 90 degrees. March them over 100 miles through the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, through snow and ice and frozen mud, all while maintaining combat readiness, keeping the men fed and the tanks fueled and the ammunition flowing, and do all of this in 48 hours. It was absurd, completely absurd. It violated every single principle of military logistics that these staff officers had learned and practiced throughout their careers. One officer muttered what several others were thinking, that Patton had finally lost his mind, that the pressure and the setbacks had pushed him over the edge. But here is what nobody understood in that moment. What made this promise different from a desperate delusion? Patton wasn't lying, and he wasn't insane. And what nobody in that smoke-filled room knew, what the laughing German commanders celebrating their surprise breakthrough definitely didn't know, was that Patton had already planned for this exact scenario. 3 separate contingency plans, drafted days earlier by his staff, with routes mapped in detail, units pre-designated for specific roles, orders ready to be transmitted the moment he gave the word. While other commanders were still scrambling to understand what was happening and where the Germans were going, Patton had already moved beyond reaction, beyond panic, straight into execution. This is the story of how the general the Germans feared most and the Allies trusted least turned an impossible logistics problem into the final disaster for Hitler's Reich on the Western Front. George Smith Patton Jr. was 59 years old in December 1944, and he was running out of time, not running out of years necessarily, though at his age and with his hard-living habits that was coming too, but running out of war. The thing he had spent his entire life preparing for, the thing he believed he was destined for, was going to end, and if it ended without him proving what he knew to be true about himself, then what had any of it meant? He had been born into a military family back in 1885, raised on stories of ancestors who had fought in every American war going back to the Revolution. His grandfather had died at the Third Battle of Winchester during the Civil War, cut down leading a charge, and that legacy sat on Patton like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders every single day. By December 1944, he commanded the Third Army, over 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, the most aggressive armored force in the entire European theater, a force that had sprinted across France after D-Day faster than anyone thought possible. But that wasn't enough, not for Patton, not even close. Because despite everything he had accomplished in North Africa and Sicily and the race across France, there were still whispers following him. People said Patton was good when the enemy was running, great at pursuit and exploitation, but put him against real resistance, and he slowed down like everyone else. The fall of 1944 had been brutal for him. His advance through Lorraine toward the heavily fortified city of Metz had ground down to a crawl, bitter fighting day after day, heavy casualties that mounted steadily, supply problems that never seemed to end, the kind of attritional warfare that made him look like every other general grinding away at an entrenched enemy. And then there was Sicily, August 1943, the incidents that nearly destroyed everything. Two separate occasions where he had physically struck soldiers who were suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, what we would now recognize as combat trauma or post-traumatic stress. He had slapped them, called them cowards, and the incidents nearly ended his career right there. General Eisenhower seriously considered sending him home in disgrace, and when the press got hold of the story, there were calls for a court-martial, demands that this general be punished for his actions. But Eisenhower knew something the newspapers didn't know, something that military intelligence had confirmed through intercepted German communications. The Germans were absolutely terrified of Patton. Wehrmacht commanders were specifically asking where is Patton before they made strategic decisions, because they knew that wherever Patton was, that's where the main attack would come. So Eisenhower kept him but sidelined him, made him part of a massive deception operation called Fortitude, where Patton commanded a fictional First Army group supposedly preparing to invade at Calais while the real D-Day landings went in at Normandy. Patton spent months as a decoy, watching other men lead the invasion he believed should have been his. And for a man who genuinely believed he was destined for martial greatness, for glory on the battlefield, it was a kind of death, a torture worse than any physical wound. By mid-December 1944, strange things were happening in the intelligence reports. Patton's G2 intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, was seeing patterns in the German radio traffic that worried him deeply. There was unusual quiet from certain sectors. Entire units seemed to be disappearing from the order of battle, the kind of radio silence that preceded something big, something dangerous. Koch brought his concerns directly to Patton on December 9th, a full week before the German attack began. "General," he said, "I think they're massing for an offensive, probably in the Ardennes sector because it's lightly held and the terrain provides concealment." Patton cut him off before he could finish. "I know," Patton said. "I've been thinking the same thing." They looked at maps together, studying the terrain and the dispositions, and the Ardennes made perfect sense from a German perspective, from an attacker's point of view. It was the same place they had broken through back in 1940, the same forests and narrow roads where they had routed the French army in 6 weeks. The terrain was terrible for large-scale military operations, dense forests and narrow winding roads and steep valleys. But that also meant it was very lightly defended because the Allies considered it basically impossible terrain for armored warfare in winter. The Germans were counting on exactly that assumption, betting everything on Allied complacency. Patton did something then that would later be called either brilliant foresight or paranoid overplanning, depending on who was telling the story. He ordered his staff to draft contingency plans for a 90-degree turn north toward the Ardennes. 3 separate plans, actually, each one moving different numbers of divisions depending on how serious the situation became. He didn't tell Eisenhower about this, didn't clear it with anyone at higher headquarters, just quietly had his staff do the work, wargaming the movements and the logistics and the timing. When the German attack finally came on December 16th, Patton was at his headquarters in Nancy when the phone rang. It was General Bradley's chief of staff calling with urgent news. "George," he said, "we've got a situation developing. The Germans have attacked in the Ardennes and it's big, really big." Patton's first reaction, according to everyone who was in the room, wasn't panic or shock or confusion. It was something closer to satisfaction, almost like he had been waiting for this. "Good," he said. "We can kill them there just as well as anywhere else." That response tells you everything you need to know about how Patton saw warfare, how his mind worked differently from other commanders. While most generals were thinking defensively about containing the breakthrough, Patton was already thinking offensively about destroying the German forces that had exposed themselves. The emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th has been described in dozens of history books and memoirs, but most accounts miss the psychological dynamic that was playing out in that room, the competing egos and philosophies, and the enormous pressure everyone was under. Eisenhower was facing immense scrutiny from above. Churchill was asking pointed questions about American competence and whether the Allies were losing control of the war. The press was starting to get wind of the disaster unfolding in the Ardennes. German radio was broadcasting triumphant claims of a massive Allied defeat, suggesting the war was far from over. The generals gathered around the table in Verdun represented fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. British Field Marshal Montgomery was cautious and methodical, obsessed with set-piece battles where every detail was planned in advance and nothing was left to chance. Bradley was solid and reliable, a steady hand, but he was clearly shaken by the complete collapse of his First Army, by how badly the Germans had surprised him. And then there was Patton, whom many people in that room still saw as more of a liability than an asset, a man whose aggressiveness bordered on recklessness. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a deliberate choice of words that revealed his leadership. "The present situation," he said, "is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." He was trying to shift the psychology in the room, trying to get his commanders thinking offensively instead of defensively. Patton, according to multiple accounts from people who were there, actually grinned at that. "Hell," he said, "let's have the guts to let them go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." That was vintage Patton, thinking about the counterattack before the attack was even contained, seeing opportunity where others saw catastrophe. That's when Eisenhower asked the question that would define everything that followed. "George," he said, "when can you attack?" What Patton proposed in response violated everything the other generals in that room knew about military movement, everything they had learned about logistics and timing and the limits of what an army could actually do. To understand why what he promised seemed impossible, you need to grasp what turning an army actually means in practical terms, the sheer complexity of the operation. The Third Army wasn't a single unified unit that could just change direction like a ship at sea. It was 6 full combat divisions spread across a 100-mile front. Each division contained roughly 15,000 men, thousands of vehicles ranging from jeeps to tanks to supply trucks, hundreds of artillery pieces, supply trains that stretched for miles along the roads. These units weren't sitting idle in reserve somewhere, waiting for orders. They were actively engaged in combat operations around Metz and in the Saar region, in contact with German forces, fighting daily battles. The roads they would need to use to move north weren't modern highways. They were narrow country lanes, many of them unpaved, winding through small villages and farmland. In mid-December, the temperature was dropping well below freezing every night. Snow and ice covered everything, making the roads treacherous and unpredictable. A single vehicle breakdown could block an entire column for hours, creating a massive traffic jam that would ripple backward for miles. The logistics were an absolute nightmare to even contemplate. Ammunition dumps that had been positioned to support operations in the Saar would now have to be moved or new ones established along the northern route. Fuel supplies had to be repositioned because tanks don't run far on empty. Medical facilities had to be relocated. And all of this had to happen, according to Patton's promise, in 72 hours or less, while maintaining operational security so the Germans didn't realize what was coming. When Patton said 48 hours, he wasn't making a wild guess or engaging in bravado. His chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, had already divided those contingency plans into detailed phases with specific timelines for each unit. The first orders, the orders that would set everything in motion, went out by encrypted radio before Patton even left the meeting at Verdun, before he even got back in his Jeep for the return trip. The night of December 19th, across a 100-mile front in eastern France, American units began what would become the most complex military redeployment in the entire history of warfare up to that point. The 4th Armored Division, which would lead the attack toward the besieged town of Bastogne, had to disengage from active combat operations near Saarbrücken, pull back from the front lines without the Germans realizing they were leaving, reposition 90 miles north through winter conditions, and arrive ready to fight immediately. They accomplished this in less than 48 hours, losing only a handful of vehicles to mechanical failure along the way. By every conventional military calculation, by every standard logistics formula, it should not have been possible, and yet it happened. What enabled this logistical miracle, what made the impossible possible, was largely invisible to outside observers, but absolutely critical. First, the Third Army had developed what they called the Red Ball Express mentality, a system where supply convoys were always in motion, treating logistics as a continuous flow rather than a series of stops and starts. They simply rerouted these convoys while they were already moving, incorporating the repositioning into the existing supply rhythm rather than treating it as something separate that required everything to halt. Second, Patton had given his supply officers immediate decentralized authority to make decisions without waiting for approval from higher headquarters. These officers created ad hoc gasoline dumps and ammunition storage points along the new route literally overnight, working through the darkness in freezing temperatures to pre-position supplies where the combat units would need them. Third, and this is something that people often overlook when they talk about the Battle of the Bulge, American industrial superiority meant mass production served as an automatic reserve for the military. Where German logistics doctrine mandated that broken vehicles had to be repaired and returned to service because replacements were scarce, American logistics enabled immediate replacement. For every tank or truck that broke down in the frozen mud and had to be abandoned, another one was immediately pulled from the massive supply reserves that had been staged throughout France since D-Day, preventing critical bottlenecks from developing. Fourth, superior communications technology gave the Americans an advantage that was decisive but often unappreciated. The crucial orders that activated the entire repositioning were sent via encrypted radio as Patton was leaving Verdun, reaching unit commanders within minutes, while German units were still relying on motorcycle couriers to carry orders between headquarters, a system that was slow and increasingly compromised by Allied air superiority. Meanwhile, at German headquarters deep in the forests of the Ardennes, the mood was absolutely triumphant, almost giddy with success. German intelligence knew exactly where Patton's Third Army was located. They had been tracking it for months, but they assumed, correctly by every normal military standard, that such a large force couldn't possibly reposition quickly enough to affect the outcome of the Ardennes offensive. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, estimated conservatively that Patton would need at least 2 full weeks to disengage from his current operations, reorganize, move north, and mount any kind of serious counterattack. 2 weeks, during which the German spearheads would have time to reach the Meuse River, possibly even drive all the way to Antwerp, and split the Allied armies completely. The German command's failure here was an act of self-imposed industrial blindness, an inability to understand just how different the logistical realities were for the two sides. Hitler's entire master plan for the offensive hinged on capturing Allied fuel depots, particularly the massive ones at Spa and Stavelot, because the German forces didn't have enough fuel to reach their objectives otherwise. The most advanced German spearhead, Kampfgruppe under the command of SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, had been quickly forced onto narrow secondary roads when they found the main routes blocked, reducing their powerful columns of Tiger II tanks to slow-moving bottlenecks that couldn't maneuver. Paper knew, he wrote in his reports, that they did not have enough fuel to reach the objective and would have to capture American supplies or fail. But Patton's Third Army, moving with full fuel and ammunition reserves that were continuously replenished, represented an industrial reality that the Germans had already dismissed as impossible, an enemy that could do things they simply couldn't do anymore. The Germans had no idea what was coming, no idea that the man they feared most was already in motion, rolling toward them through the snow. December 22, 1944, and the Third Army's attack jumped off at 0600 hours in conditions that would have stopped most military operations completely cold. The temperature was 8 degrees Fahrenheit, that's -13 Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. A massive storm system had moved in overnight, dropping 6 inches of new snow on top of the ice that was already covering the roads, making movement treacherous and visibility terrible. The cold killed in ways that combat didn't, in ways that were invisible to the history books later. Weapons froze solid. The oil and machine guns turned to thick sludge that prevented them from firing. Tank engines wouldn't start at all, without crews spending hours heating the oil pans with blowtorches. And yet the attack went forward exactly as Patton had promised. The soldiers of the Third Army faced an enemy that few movies or documentaries ever really show because it's not as dramatic as combat footage, but it was just as deadly. The terrain itself became an equal foe to the Germans. Every single mile gained by the 4th Armored Division was a battle against the frozen ground and the snow and the ice. American infantry wrapped burlap sacks around their boots to prevent frostbite and keep their feet dry. Tank crews stuffed newspapers into their uniforms for extra insulation against the cold that seeped through the steel. The snow made movement completely unpredictable, vehicles slipping and sliding, columns getting stuck and having to be pulled out by other vehicles. Meanwhile, German material inferiority was compounding their already desperate fuel crisis in ways that made their situation hopeless. Many German vehicles, especially later in the war, were running on synthetic oil produced from coal because they had lost access to natural petroleum sources, and this synthetic oil performed terribly in extreme cold, becoming thick and sluggish. Their armored behemoths, the famous Tiger and Panther tanks that were superior to American Shermans in direct combat, were absolute logistical nightmares in winter conditions, prone to breakdowns and mechanical failures that left them stranded, trapped in the very forests they were supposed to be dominating. The 4th Armored Division's advance toward Bastogne on that first day covered only 7 miles, just 7 miles through defended terrain, fighting both the Germans and the weather simultaneously, but 7 miles was progress, and that was what mattered. Every village they came to became a separate small battle. German infantry dug into cellars and fighting from behind stone walls. Tank warfare became brutal close quarters fighting in streets too narrow for proper maneuvers. But Patton had numbers on his side, overwhelming material superiority. For every Sherman tank that was knocked out or destroyed, 2 more were already moving up to take its place. The supply lines he had established, those improvised fuel dumps and ammunition points, kept everything flowing forward despite the terrible conditions. The town of Bastogne sat at a critical strategic crossroads where 7 different roads converged, which made it incredibly important for both sides. By December 22nd, the 101st Airborne Division had been completely encircled there for 6 days, cut off from all supplies and reinforcements. The situation was desperate and getting worse. The 101st was running dangerously low on ammunition after days of fighting off German attacks from multiple directions. They were running low on medical supplies to treat their wounded. Food was being rationed. German commanders, believing the position was hopeless, sent a formal surrender ultimatum under a white flag of truce. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st since their actual commander had been away when the attack started, read the surrender demand. His response has become one of the most famous moments of the entire war. He wrote down a single word on paper. Nuts. That one-word refusal, which left the German officers who received it completely confused about what it meant, became instant legend when word spread through the American forces, but it was Patton's relief force grinding toward them through the snow that would make the legend actually meaningful. On December 20th, 2 days before the attack began, Patton had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, with an unusual and specific request. "Chaplain," he said, "I want you to write me a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans." The prayer O'Neill composed was printed on small cards and distributed to every single man in the Third Army. It read, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle." On December 23rd, as if in answer, the clouds broke for the first time in over a week. Allied fighter bombers that had been grounded by the weather took to the air in massive numbers. The psychological impact on the German forces was as devastating as the physical destruction. German infantry who had been advancing under the cover of the storm, protected by clouds from Allied air power, suddenly found themselves completely exposed to devastating attacks from above. The breakthrough to Bastogne finally came at 1650 hours on December 26th, late in the afternoon when the light was already starting to fade. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, was pushing up a snow-covered road south of the town when he saw American helmets through his periscope. He shouted out of his tank, not sure if they were Americans or Germans wearing captured equipment. "Come here," he yelled. "This is the 4th Armored." The response from the trees was immediate. "Welcome to Bastogne." The corridor Boggess had opened was only 500 yards wide, barely a quarter mile, but it was enough. Within hours, more tanks and trucks were pouring through that narrow gap, bringing desperately needed supplies to the besieged garrison, bringing ammunition and medical supplies and food. By late December, by the end of the month, the entire German offensive had reached its high water mark and begun to recede like a tide going out. German fuel supplies were now completely exhausted, used up in the offensive with no hope of resupply. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had been shot out of the sky whenever it tried to intervene. By the time Bastogne was definitely relieved and the corridor widened, the offensive had already failed in its strategic objectives. The Germans just didn't know it yet, or perhaps they knew but couldn't admit it. Patton understood this intuitively, saw the bigger picture. In a conversation with General Bradley on December 28th, he said something that revealed his strategic thinking. "Brad," he said, "this time the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." The systematic destruction of German forces trapped in the Bulge began in earnest. Kampfgruppe, that elite spearhead that had driven so deep into American lines, was eventually forced to retreat on foot through the forests, abandoning nearly all its tanks, including dozens of supposedly invincible Tiger II heavy tanks, simply because they had been completely without fuel for over 2 days and couldn't move. The abandoned hardware scattered through the Ardennes told the final damning story of Germany's industrial collapse. By January 16th, when American forces advancing from north and south finally met at Houffalize and closed the Bulge completely, the casualty figures told a devastating story for Germany. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Over 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned in the forests, irreplaceable losses. But the strategic cost for Germany was far higher than just the immediate casualties. The Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last operational reserves, the final mobile forces that could have been used to defend against the coming Soviet offensive. When the Red Army launched its massive winter offensive on the Eastern Front in mid-January, pushing toward Berlin, there was essentially nothing left to stop them because everything had been thrown into the Ardennes gamble and lost. The Americans could replace their losses, every tank, every vehicle, every man, within weeks through their industrial base and mobilization system. Germany couldn't replace anything anymore. The 72-hour redeployment of 6 full combat divisions through winter conditions wasn't luck or accident or favorable circumstances. It was professional military excellence at the highest level combined with genuine strategic foresight. The fact that Patton had drafted those contingency plans days before the German attack, when nobody else was even considering the possibility, showed remarkable strategic vision and an understanding of how the enemy might think. After the war ended, when German generals were systematically interrogated by Allied intelligence officers trying to understand how the Wehrmacht had fought, many of them were specifically asked about Patton, about their perceptions of him. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, said something revealing. "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man who knew how to handle armor brilliantly in the field. His tactics of push, push, and still more push were what we most feared. We did not expect him to react so quickly to the Ardennes. We thought we would have at least 2 weeks, perhaps 3, before the Third Army could seriously affect the situation. When he did it in 2 days, when his forces hit our flank while we were still advancing, this was extraordinary, unprecedented. This was the nightmare scenario we had discussed but thought was impossible." The Germans had always feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. Now they knew exactly why that fear had been justified. In his personal diary, which was private and not meant for official consumption, Patton wrote an entry on December 27th that revealed his own assessment of what had been accomplished. "The ability to get the Third Army turned and attacking in under 3 days will probably be considered by military historians a masterpiece of logistics and operational planning. But it's really quite simple when you know what you're doing and you've prepared properly." He had spent his entire life, from childhood listening to his grandfather's war stories through West Point and decades of peacetime army service and combat in 2 world wars, preparing for exactly this kind of moment. When the moment finally came, when everything was on the line, he wasn't improvising or making it up as he went. He was executing plans built on decades of study and experience and hard-won knowledge about how armies actually move and fight. Winston Churchill, writing about the battle afterward in his memoirs, called it something significant. "This was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war," he wrote, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory, a triumph of American initiative and determination. The staff officers who had laughed when Patton said 48 hours, who had thought he was delusional or lying or had finally cracked under pressure, were wrong because they didn't understand that Patton operated beyond conventional limitations, that he had studied wars so deeply and prepared so thoroughly that he could accomplish things that seemed impossible to other people. The Germans laughed too when their intelligence reported Patton moving north, thought there was no way he could arrive in time to matter, until they stopped laughing, until they found themselves retreating through those snow-covered forests with the white ground stained crimson with their own blood, pursued relentlessly by an American army that had appeared as suddenly and destructively as a winter storm. The Ardennes forest became not Hitler's great triumph that would turn the tide of the war, but his final catastrophic defeat in the West, the moment when Germany's last hope died in the frozen mud and snow. The blood that stained those winter fields, soaking into the snow and turning it red, was German blood, not American, and that made all the difference.